The Bremen-Verden Campaign was a conflict during the Northern Wars in Europe. For the 15th of September 1675 to the 13th of August 1676, an anti-Swedish coalition comprising Brandenburg-Prussia, the neighbouring imperial princedoms of Lüneburg and Münster, and the Kingdom of Denmark conquered the Duchies of Bremen and Verden. Bremen-Verden, a remote outpost of Sweden's Baltic Sea Empire, was the third Swedish imperial fief in North Germany granted under the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, alongside Swedish Pomerania and the Barony of Wismar. Following its conquest, it remained in Allied hands until the end of the war in 1679, but was then fully returned to Sweden in the wake of the Treaties of Nijmegen. For the major warring parties of Sweden, Brandenburg and Denmark, this theatre of war in northwest Germany was only of secondary significance. Background: after France had invaded the General States in 1672 as retribution for the outcome of the War of Devolution, an alliance formed up against her. The conflict escalated into the Dutch War. In order to relieve her increasingly stretched forces, therefore, France urged its traditional ally, Sweden, to go to war against her enemies, who, in addition to the States General, included the House of Habsburg and the electorate of Brandenburg. At the end of 1674, a Swedish army under the imperial commander, Carl Gustav Wrangel, invaded the Margraviate of Brandenburg, which was militarily almost unprotected, while the Brandenburg army under Elector Frederic William I found itself at war with France. In a short summer campaign in 1675, Frederic William succeeded in defeating the Swedish army and pushing it back to Swedish Pomerania, encouraged by the Brandenburg victory. On the 17th of July 1675, the imperial ban was imposed on the Swedish king in his capacity as an imperial prince in Pomerania, Mecklenburg and Bremen-Verden, and war was declared by the Holy Roman Empire against Sweden. The Westphalian and Upper Saxon circles were charged with the enforcement of the ban against the Swedes. A little later came the declaration of war by Denmark on Sweden. In this large-scale war, the Allies, Denmark and Brandenburg, initially intended to conquer the Swedish possessions in northern Germany, then used the full might in the theatres of war in Scania. But with the conquest of Bremen-Verden, located on the southern border of Denmark, Sweden would have secured a potential springboard against Denmark. Another political power factor was that it would give the Swedes opportunities to recruit mercenaries. The war planning that took place on the Swedish homeland envisaged military victory being achieved through the deployment of the Swedish fleet, which was likely to defeat the Danish fleet in the Baltic Sea, thus relieving Sweden's North German possessions, so it could then, in a further step, land on Zealand, the heart of the Danish kingdom. Sweden's chances in the Duchy of Bremen-Verden, therefore, lay principally in the strength of her own fleet, which was to have ensured a military victory by dispatching additional troops from the motherland. However, since the Swedish fleet could not sail due to delays in equipment, Bremen-Verden was not reinforced and had to rely on its in-place forces. Sweden's forces in the Duchy of Bremen-Verden were numerically weak and distributed across several fortified bases. The bulk of the Swedish army was in Stade, Carlsberg and 7 other small fortresses. They would only be able to oppose large-scale offensive operations with delaying tactics. The Swedish defense plans were based on siege warfare. The number of the fortified places would force her potential opponents to fight a series of arduous, small sieges, but it also fragmented the troops available to the defenders and prevented them from forming a mobile field army. Diplomatic preparations. The Roman Catholic Prince-Bishop of Munster, Christoph Bernhard von Galen, who was intent on extending his power and who, until the 22nd of April 1674, sided with France in battle against the Netherlands, signed an agreement on the 7th of June 1675 with the imperial court in Vienna that obliged him to supply 9,000 troops to the emperor and for imperial service. As a result of this obligation, the bishop was made to participate in the war against Sweden. On 21 September 1675, a treaty of neutrality was signed between the Allies, the Prince-Bishopric of Munster, Denmark and Brandenburg on the one hand and John Frederick of Brunswick-Lüneburg on the other. Brunswick-Lüneburg, which hitherto had been on the Swedish side, therefore agreed to remain neutral in the upcoming fight against Sweden. The treaty between the four allies was signed primarily because it was in the political interests of the imperial princes involved, rather than in discharge of their obligation to defend the circle or empire. Thus the execution of the imperial ban was carried out by the respective territorial armies, while the circle troops took no significant part in the fighting. Autumn 1675 campaign. Invasion of Bremen-Verden by the Munster army. The campaign began on the 15th of September 1675 in the southwest of the Swedish territory when, according to the reports of the Theatrum Europaeum, about 10,000 men, according to other records 4,000 men, of the Prince-Bishop of Munster passed through Hasselön and invaded the Swedish amt of Wildshausen. They continued their advance to the river Weser unimpeded. On the 25th of September at Bremen, Munster's artillery fired across the Weser. A Brandenburg force of 1,600 infantry and 700 cavalry under Major General Freyr von Span, coming from Westphalian territory, also arrived in Bremen at the end of September. The Danes participated with 2,500 men under the orders of Count Gustavus Adolphus of Baudissan. The Munster troops under Prince Bishop von Galen marched from neutral Bremen to the fortress of Langwedel on the Weser, capturing it on 27 and the 28th of September. With that, the way into the state of the former Prince-Bishopric of Verden was open. Verden upon Alli itself fell into Allied hands on the 27th of September. Munster forces suddenly invaded the town and established themselves at one of the town gates. After Verden, the town of Rothenburg was conquered, falling after some resistance. Further, the marching column pressed on immediately towards Ottersberg, which was taken on the 3rd of October 1675 by the now seasoned troops of the Prince-Bishop of Munster. The roughly 140-man Swedish garrison were taken prisoner. The Allied army then marched in a northeasterly direction with Buxtehude as their objective, reaching it on the 12th of October. Buxtehude was well fortified, had plenty of food and munitions and, according to the Theatrum Europaeum, a garrison of nearly 400 men. A siege appeared inevitable. After occupying an important eminence in front of the town that same day, the Allies drew up all their artillery of 14 mortars and 37 cannon into battery positions. Shelling commenced on the morning of the 13th of October, setting fire to over 60 houses. On the 14th of October, a total of 100 mortar bombs and 60 artillery shells were fired into the town from howitzers and mortars, again wreaking much damage, but without causing a single fatality. On the 15th of October, fire was lifted in order for the trenches necessarily for an assault on the town to be prepared and in order to launch an all-out attack. Because the shelling had already resulted in heavy damage, the Buxtehude commandant, Hamilton, was forced to surrender the town, having been implored by its citizens and his German mercenaries who had learned of the pronouncement of the imperial ban on Sweden. the garrison was permitted to withdraw to stay, taking its belongings and sidearms. On the 16th of October the Allies entered the town, 24 cannon and the munitions falling into the hands as a result. After the fall of Buxtehude, several Allied regiments pushed forward towards Bremen-Verden. On the 25th of October the siege of Bremen-Verden fortress began. After 3 days of heavy shelling, the mercenaries, who were mainly German, refused to render military service for the garrison. The Allies sent a trumpeter into the town as a parlementaire. He threatened the garrison that all German combatants would be executed when the fortress was captured. The threat was based on the fact that they had used the weapons in the service of an outlaw against the Holy Roman Empire. In view of the situation, the Swedish commander had no choice but to surrender the place. The Swedish officers and men were given free passage with all the possessions and weapons, whilst most of the Germans transferred to the Allied side. As the result of a previous agreement amongst the Allies, the town had been promised to the Lüneburg troops, who entered Buxtehude with 500 men. At this time on the fortresses of Carlsberg and Stade remained in Swedish hands. Brandenburg and Danish landing operations in parallel with the advance of Munster, Brandenburg and Danish troops. There were 2 unsuccessful landing attempts by Danish and Brandenburg forces that were repulsed by the Swedes with heavy losses. The first landing operation, at the end of September, was carried out near Karlshagen by a Brandenburg formation under Admiral Simon de Bolfay. In order to conquer the strategically important Carlsberg fortress on the Weser, this Swedish fortress had been first constructed in 1672 with the task of controlling the mouth of the Weser. Approaching from the river Elbe, a Brandenburg squadron of 7 ships appeared, with a landing force of 534 men. Together with the ship's complements, the whole force comprised about 800 to 900 men. On the 28th of September, the troops were landed near Lech, north of Carlsberg. Because the Swedish commander of Carlsberg, which was relatively strongly defended by about 800 soldiers, refused to surrender, the Brandenburg Admiral de Bolfay had his troops erect earthworks in front of the town and, on the 30th of September, opened fire with several salvos from his ship's guns. However, on the same day the landing force pulled back from its positions in front of the fortress, in the course of which 30 Brandenburg soldiers switched sides to join the Swedes. Encouraged by the statements of these deserters, on the 1st of October the Swedes launched an attack with 200 men, but had to withdraw with losses after a brief fight. In order to relieve Carlsberg fortress, 13 squadrons of cavalry were dispatched from Stade under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Seiden. The Brandenburgers, who were now clearly outnumbered, were informed by scouts of the approaching force. They lifted the siege and embarked on the ships again on the 2nd of October. Due to unfavorable winds, the ships, now loaded with the infantry, found themselves close to the shore as the Swedish reinforcements arrived. Consequently, they were attacked by the Swedes and, after resisting a short time, had to capitulate to superior forces. Total losses suffered by the Brandenburg force during this operation came to 314 men, the majority taken prisoner. Roughly at the same time, a Danish flotilla landed 6 companies of infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Harrige on the territory of Landwessen. But after the successful defense of Carlsberg, the Swedish units under Seiden attacked these Danish mercenaries. After several battles on the 4th of October, the Swedes succeeded in defeating the Danes and taking 400 of them prisoner. Of these, 200 were then taken into Swedish service and ordered to reinforce the garrison at Carlsberg. The other prisoners were held in Stade. The main body of the Swedish troops returned to Stade on the 7th of October. The naval blockade of Carlsberg was lifted and the 7 Brandenburg ships repaired instead to the River Elbe in order to cut off the seaward supply route to the town of Stade. By contrast, Carlsberg was besieged again in late October, despite the Swedes' previous successful defense of the town. Allied change of command. In October, about 3,000 men of the Principality of Lüneburg under the command of Duke George William of Brunswick-Lüneburg arrived in the theatre of war from the Rhineland. As the appointed circle colonel of the Lower Saxon Circle, the Duke took overall command of the now 12,000-strong Allied army. In the headquarters of Prince Bishop von Galen in Rotenburg, a secret treaty was signed on the 14th of October, wherein the Prince Bishop, Duke George William and Duke Rudolf Augustus of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel agreed to provide mutual support to one another in the ensuing campaign. Furthermore, a provisional division of the conquests was negotiated that excluded Denmark and Brandenburg. In the aftermath of this campaign there was considerable disagreement and distrust, as the Protestant federated princes did not want to give the Roman Catholic Prince Bishop von Galen too much influence in a Protestant imperial circle. Attacks on Stade. The siege of Carlsberg. Swedish raids. On the 4th of November the Allies advanced on Stade, the HQ of the Swedish regional government of Bremen-Verden. The Stade garrison under Field Marshal Henrik Horn, the Swedish Governor-General of the Duchy, had 5,624 soldiers and 600 militia at his disposal. In the face of the threat, Horn had the town thoroughly prepared for defense, to prevent the desertion of German mercenaries in Stade upon arrival of the Allies. The Marshal used material incentives and propaganda. Since Sweden had been declared an enemy of the Empire, and Emperor Leopold I, in declaring the Mandata Avocatoria, had ordered that all subjects of the Holy Roman Empire had to renounce Swedish service. German mercenaries were deserting the Swedish forces in droves. So, at the beginning of November, Horn had the former Buxtehude commander, Hamilton, publicly executed for surrendering the fortress in Stade prematurely. All German mercenaries in Stade had to publicly re-swear their oath of allegiance to the Swedish crown. By adopting this brutal approach, Field Marshal Horn was able to discipline his garrison force for the time being and ensure its serious defense. Repeated attacks on the fortress of Stade on 6 and 7 November 1675 were unsuccessful, and the Allies could not agree on continuing the siege of the town because of its stubborn resistance and the onset of winter. Finally, on the 9th of November, the Allies withdrew the troops into winter quarters. The hitherto captured forts remained under Allied occupation, in order to maintain the blockade of Stade. The Brandenburg troops left the theatre of war heading for the Duchy of Cleves and Principality of Minden. The Swedes took advantage of the lull around the garrisoned fortresses to temporarily wrest back the initiative. They repeatedly carried out raids and sent out foraging parties. Individual companies went upriver to Buxtehude, Krans and Altona, and downriver to Bielenberg and Colmar, burning and pillaging. Their exploits included the destruction and capture of several Danish and Dutch ships on the Elbe. In early January, Colonel Sidai, with about 400 dragoons and 400 infantrymen, led another Swedish expedition to Freiburg, Elbe in Kedingen against about 500 entrenched Munster soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Lambsdorff. Following the failure of a frontal assault by the Swedes, Sidai ordered his dragoons to circumvent the position and attack the rear of the Danish position. After the dragoons had taken their assault position in the village as per their orders, a Swedish attack was launched on the earthworks from all sides. The Munster troops sustained heavy losses, gave up the position and fled, pursued by Swedish cavalry. 260 were captured. By contrast, the Swedes lost just 50 men in the Battle of Freiburg on the Elbe. Among the prisoners were 15 mercenaries who had originally joined up for Swedish service, but had changed sides after the fall of Bremen-Verden. They were made an example of. One of the deserters was quartered in Stade as a deterrent, 5 were hanged and 9 were branded. This successful phase for the Swedes came to an end when Carlsberg, which had been besieged since the end of October, capitulated. A lack of ammunition, food and soldiers resulted in the surrender of the fortress on the 22nd of January by its commander, the Frenchman, Colonel Jean Mel, to the united Munster, Danish and Lüneburg siege troops. The Swedish garrison, still about 380 strong, were given free passage. At the surrender of the fortress 80 cannon fell into the hands of the Allies. In accordance with the treaty, a mixed Munster and Lüneburg garrison took over. Allied disagreements, because the Prince-Bishopric of Munster and the Duchy of Lüneburg had agreed in advance to exclude Denmark and Brandenburg from the future division of Bremen-Verden. There were serious arguments amongst the Allies, which affected and endangered the continuation of hostilities against Sweden. For example, the Prince-Bishopric of Munster demanded the former Prince-Bishopric of Verden, the Amter of Wildshausen, Berg, Bremervord, Ottersberg and Thedinghausen. The rest was to be annexed by Lüneburg-Celle. Denmark and Brandenburg, on the other hand, argued for an equal distribution of Allied conquests. Denmark demanded Carlsberg and Stade, and thus the control of the Weser and Elbe estuaries, in order to be able to exchange them later in return for the deployment of auxiliary troops from Munster and Lüneburg for the Pomeranian War. This dispute involving conflicting territorial claims escalated to such an extent that it threatened to come to open war between the Allies. The General States endeavored to mediate between the parties to this situation, so as not to jeopardize the war against France. They therefore sent ambassadors, initially Van der Tocht and, later, Amerongen, to Bremen for the negotiations. The Stadtholder of the Netherlands, William III of Orange, proposed that all fortresses in Bremen-Verden should be slighted, to negotiate the final apportionment of territory at the Peace Congress in Nijmegen and to transfer provisional administration of both duchies to Lüneburg, Celle and Munster. Brandenburg and Denmark were expressly entitled to retain the rights to territorial interests in Bremen-Verden if, contrary to expectations, they did not achieve compensation in Swedish Pomerania and Scania. Although Brandenburg's envoy wanted to reach a provisional breakdown of the areas in question in The Hague, on the 28th of March he gave his approval to the treaty because he saw no other way to achieve an end to the dispute between the Allies, something which was essential for the continuation of the campaign. Although the Elector of Brandenburg did not ratify the decision of his envoy, he dropped his objections to the deployment of Lüneburg auxiliaries to Bremen-Verden in the light of the favorable progress being made in the war against Sweden and Swedish Pomerania. Nevertheless, the Elector secured Denmark's support in a secret agreement in early 1677 that Brandenburg should get at least 1/5 of territory to be divided in Bremen-Verden. Siege of Stade, 1676. The ongoing dispute over the distribution of Bremen-Verden amongst the Allies delayed the onset of the Siege of Stade until spring 1676. The Allies agreed the terms on the 28th of April and the 8th of May in Bremervord. This envisaged the attack on the last Swedish possession to be carried out with 16,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. The conquered fortress was to be filled equally by troops from Denmark, Brandenburg, Lüneburg, Celle and Munster. In early April the Lüneburg commander, Lieutenant General Witt, implemented measures to block blockade the town. As a consequence, there were almost daily skirmishes and Swedish raids with varying degrees of success. At the same time, the besiegers began to build earthworks. Stade had access to the sea by virtue of its location at the mouth of the Schwing, a tributary of the Elbe. Part of the Swedish fortifications also included a fieldwork that guarded the mouth of the Schwing in Stad Ösand. Under its protection, several Swedish ships were able to reach the town, providing much-needed supplies during the course of the siege. So to prevent access to Stade from the sea and thus tighten the stranglehold of the siege, the Allies decided to seize the Schwing fieldwork. To this end, they called for artillery from Gluckstadt and also brought in two 18-gun Lüneburg ships into the mouth of the Schwing. All Swedish attempts to disrupt the preparations were repulsed. The Allies drew closer and closer to the hill and established a battery that opened a continual fire on the Swedish position. On the 23rd of April, the Swedes carried out a new raid with 300 horsemen, but were again driven back after initial success with a loss of 46 men. According to contemporary sources, on the 4th of July, the Allies completed their earthworks and shelled the Schwing position so heavily that its roughly 100-man unit capitulated. With the loss of the Schwing fieldwork, the resupply of Stade from the sea was no longer possible. When 3 Swedish warships, held up by unfavorable winds, and 6 other transport ships loaded with supplies, reached the mouth of the Schwing, they were shelled by Allied batteries stationed on the banks of the Schwing estuary. The Swedish fleet had to withdraw from Stade and, after a few raids into the area around the Elbe, they left. Cut off from all resupply, the situation in the fortress of Stade deteriorated considerably. An outbreak of shigellosis reduced the strength of the garrison to around 3,000 soldiers. With the deterioration in the material situation, morale amongst the besieged fell. Twice there were mutinies amongst the Swedish soldiers which could only be put down with the use of repressive measures. The desertion of German mercenaries now grew to such an extent that active defense with patrols and raids was no longer possible. In June, the earthworks on the Allied side were so far advanced that they reached the town moats. However, the town was not shelled because they had intended to starve its citizens and not storm it in order to protect their own forces. Countermeasures by the Swedish garrison consisted of flooding the surrounding area by opening the locks on the river. However, the besiegers succeeded in draining the water through 2 channels to the Elbe. As the supply situation in the town became ever more critical, the Stade citizens and the garrison's Governor-General Horn were forced to negotiate with the besiegers. The negotiations began on 23 July. However, they were delayed at the behest of population who, despite the tougher conditions, preferred to be garrisoned by Protestant Lüneburg troops rather than Catholic Munster forces. As a result of the surrender negotiations, the town was to be occupied by 9 Lüneburg companies under General Witt. The German mercenaries had to terminate the Swedish service. In the early morning of the 13th of August 1676, Field Marshal Horn, with 10 cannon and 800 Swedish soldiers, pulled out. The 1,400 German mercenaries were either detained or released. The last Swedish bastion in Bremen-Verden was now in Allied hands.